And the adjustment for the sound is right here. Ladies, we're going to go ahead and continue with our program today. And I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Mel Tsipouria, who is president of the U.S. Georgia Friendship Association, and which, if you know anything about geography, I know a lot of you are retired teachers, that's located right next door to the Ukraine. And so he is a local expert on the issues that are going on over in that area of the world, and he is going to be speaking to us today on some of those issues.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today, and it's an honor and privilege to speak before you. Paula, thank you for inviting. I'm going to speak about a little bit about myself, a little bit about Georgia and Ukraine-Russia conflict. I'm going to speak a little bit more detail about Georgia because it's kind of related, connected to the Ukrainian conflict, and will give you a better understanding of that conflict and the reasons and what's going on. First of all, my name is Mel Tsipouria, as I was already introduced, president of U.S. Georgia Friendship Association. It's a nonprofit organization. And kind of name speaks for itself. We work on issues of deepening friendship between the two countries. Primarily, so far I've been working closely with many U.S. politicians, congressmen, and we do organize meetings in Washington, D.C. between U.S. congressmen and ambassadors from Georgia. The reason I say ambassadors, we had organized with the current ambassador when he was new, with the previous ambassador, we did the first congressional meetings we organized for the previous ambassador of Georgia to the United States. Last March, I had to make a trip to Washington, and the reason was mainly situation in Ukraine and to support Ukraine, and met with 10 congressmen personally, and also met with 5 foreign policy staffer of 5 other congressmen, and also foreign policy staffer of U.S. senator. I'm going to say who that senator is. You just don't get mad at me, but I have to work with both sides. That was Barbara Boxer. So, but as a nonprofit, we have to work with both sides on that issue. But let me say that they were very pleasant. And some other congressmen that I met, some of them, with some of them I already worked for many years, and they are very helpful, and especially understand the situation and the importance of taking care of and stand by our allies like they're standing with us. In case of Georgia, Georgia is one of the, well, actually it was highest per capita trip contributed to Iraq mission. It's in its latter stage, and it is highest per capita trip contributed to Afghanistan. And Paula just reminded me a few minutes ago, a couple of years ago, we did the event with the Republican Party for wounded Georgian soldiers that were treated in Balboa Naval Hospital. It was a great event. Most of them were double or single amputees. Actually, all of them double or single. That's why they were here in the first place. But we had good exposure. We had about over 300 people, local TV, and I believe there were broadcasts of that footage in Georgia. And I'll tell you that is very important for our allies to see that their efforts are recognized and appreciated. Those are young guys in their early 20s and without both legs or single leg. Also, a little bit more about my organization's activity. In 2012, in July, went to Georgia with 6 United States congressmen, had great meetings with Georgian officials, Deputy Defense Minister, and some other ministers. And the highlight of the trip was, well, first of all, we had several meetings scheduled. We opened a clinic with whom we're going to partner with and do some charity and medical missions actually to help those the veterans from Afghanistan and their families. And U.S. ambassador always accompanies, that's a protocol, U.S. congressman on a trip in that particular country. So U.S. ambassador said after our last joint meeting, then congressman had to go and had a dinner with the president of Georgia. At the time it was Mikhail Saakashvili. And he kind of apologized. He said, you could not go because, you know, that was a protocol, and kind of I wasn't invited. I said, fine. I was very happy with our meetings already. And so we had this last meeting together in Marriott Hotel in the capital, and all of a sudden ambassador comes over and says, well, President of Georgia will be delighted to have you over. I'm thinking, what happened? So when they told Congressman, well, we are leaving in half an hour going to an airport, they said, is Mel coming? My nickname, well, short name, Mallory. And ambassador said no. And Congressman, actually it was California Congressman Jeff Denham from the Central Valley, he said, I'm not going if he's not going. So that was a nice gesture, needless to say. And so anyway, they took us to airport, and I still don't know where we are going. And there was a helicopter, turned out it's a presidential helicopter, and there were several ministers of Georgia, and all of a sudden President of Georgia is coming. So he jumped in with us, hi, and there we go. And we flew to his ranch outside of the capital, about 1 hour. Spectacular scenery, we had great time, and we did speak about U.S.-Georgia relations too. So anyway, that's a little bit about our activity as an organization and what we do and what we have done. I also, beside that, I'm a Republican activist for many years now. I'm on a central committee, an executive committee, and recently was reappointed as a chairman of the finance committee of the local Republican Party. My country, Georgia, it's one of the oldest countries. We got almost 3,000 years old alphabet. It's a small country, size of South Carolina, about 4.5 million population. But it's a very important country because it's located on a Black Sea. It's between Russia and Turkey, and northeast of us is Ukraine, as you mentioned. Now, why it is important, and why I said in the beginning that I'm going to talk about Georgia for you better to understand what's going on in Ukraine. Now, being on a Black Sea, there is a couple of other countries east of us. One of them is Azerbaijan, the other one is Armenia. But Azerbaijan has a lot of oil and gas supplies. And there is a pipeline, 2 pipelines coming from Azerbaijan through Georgia, going to European markets, delivering those supplies. That's why Georgia's location is very important. Beside that, there is a lot more potential. They are building a 3rd round of pipelines. But also, east of Azerbaijan, there is Caspian Sea. East of Caspian Sea, there are another 5 former Soviet Asian republics. They are Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. 2 of them, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, have also vast supplies of oil and gas. Right now they are producing, but they are connected to the Russian pipeline system, which is longer, more expensive, but that's how Russia wants it. Because that way they control those energies and the routes, delivering them to the European markets. Now, why it's so important for Russia, and I'm going to talk a little bit deeper about that and explaining situation in Russia. But Russia's economy is largely depends on energy. And Russia, unfortunately, got very corrupt government, to say the least. And obviously Putin is a dictator, and a ruthless dictator at that. So since they are depending on energy, it's very important for them to control those energy routes. They would control the prices, and also situation about Middle East, Iran, and Syria, and Russia's involvement. Now, for Russia, it's convenient for them to maintain instability in that region, especially with Iran. When we're talking about Iran issue, Iran problem, that's not really an Iranian issue, it's a Russian issue, meaning coming from Russia. Who is building atomic nuclear reactor in Iran? Russia. And why? Because again, they wanted to maintain that instability, that tension that keeps world oil prices high, because that's their main income. If today world prices would go 50%, they have serious economic problems. So in Georgia, I explained the situation with the pipelines coming from Azerbaijan, how Russia wants to control it. Now, when Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Russia instigated similar problem in Georgia, just like they are doing today in Ukraine. So we had these two Georgian regions called Abkhazia and South Ossetia, just like Crimea in Ukraine. So they started this so-called separatist movement. They orchestrated, they financed it, and so those regions declared independence from Georgia. So we had armed conflicts with Russia's military participation, over 10,000 Georgians dead, 300,000 refugees, and so we lost control of the territory, just like Crimea is controlled today by Russia. So that's about 20% of our Georgian land. And also, some of you might remember in 2008, just a few years ago, there was a 5-day war between Russia and Georgia going on during Olympic Games in China. So, and war ended with a truce negotiated with President Nicolas Sarkozy at the time of France, but they took away a little bit of more land from the South Ossetia region. Now, why that is important and how it's related to the Ukrainian conflict. When you do something like that, in this case Russia, and it's going unpunished without no consequences, they feel free to do it again. Simple as that. Combine that with recently, unfortunately, our president and all of us as Americans, whether we are Democrat or Republicans, we want our president to succeed, especially on a foreign stage. We got the red lines that we are not following up and respecting when it's violated. And no wonder Putin feels free to do whatever he wants to do. So because those actions in Georgia were unpunished, so Putin did a similar thing in Ukraine. Now, what happened in Ukraine? They were going to sign, they refused to sign agreement with Russia. Russia is trying to reconstitute in different kind of forms Soviet Union. They have this Euro-Asian Union as opposed to European Union. So they are forcing all the former Soviet republics to sign and go into that union with Russia. And Ukraine, people of Ukraine refused to do that and expressed willingness to sign with the European Union. So Putin, as a punishment, and also for him it was very important not to lose Ukraine. Why? Because again, those energy routes and energy pipelines I mentioned, there are other sets of pipelines coming from Russia through Ukraine and go into European markets. So they totally want to control the energy supplies and its delivery. There is also another reason they did not want Ukraine go, which is Black Sea port and Russian presence in the Black Sea. Black Sea is very important, especially for such a huge country as Russia, not to have any military presence in the Black Sea because their own territory is a very small stretch. Biggest Russian fleet is located in Ukraine, in the Crimean Peninsula, in the city of Sevastopol. And even though they got long-term agreement with Ukraine and lease, but they still were afraid to lose that, and that was kind of second reason they attacked Ukraine. And again, of course, it was and it is unjust. And you might have seen on TV that the elections were very successful for them, for separatists. Well, first of all, elections were illegal. And they were successful 90% or so because Ukrainians did not participate in the election. In those regions, Ukrainians are minorities and Russians are majority. So Russians would have won anyway, but that would not have made legal and correct because it's against Ukrainian constitution to vote for a succession from the country unless whole country votes for it and not just that particular region. So, and then when the Crimean situation happened and when our response was very timid and weak, that's why he continued further with, because he wants to swallow rest of Ukraine, not just Crimea, not just eastern Ukraine, but rest of Ukraine, whole of Ukraine, just like he wants to take over whole of Georgia. So that's why he continued in eastern Ukraine with a similar separatist movement and organizing, financing, sending his KGB operatives, KGB today called FSB, they just changed the name, And also they're recruiting in large numbers volunteers, well, not the volunteers, mercenaries. They paid mercenaries to fight and have instability in Ukraine. And when there's instability or civil war, then it's easier to control and to do their evil deeds, so to speak. Now, why Russia is afraid of losing Ukraine, beside those couple of things that I mentioned? Also, in case of Ukraine, in case of Georgia, we are trying to get membership in NATO for obvious reasons. First of all, the main reason is because our values coincide with many of the key European countries. And that's why Georgia, in case of Georgia, is fighting side by side against terror, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, and recently even Georgia sent some small contingent of troops in Africa to, again, participate in a mission of our allies. Now, in case of Russia, in case Georgia becomes member of NATO, and Ukraine becomes member of NATO, what does that mean in practical terms? It means stability. It means no more wars or no more attacks on Georgia. It means investment, because in case of Georgia, let's say, or even Ukraine, it's a very good strategic location. It could be hub of business between East and West. And it means prosperity down the road, let's say in the case of Georgia, right? Now, how or why would Putin be afraid of that? Because that would be an example that it's possible, being a democratic country, have a true democratic elections and prosper. As opposed to Russia, there is no resemblance of democracy, and it's a strongman rule, dictator rule, and he doesn't want Russian people to see any better example next door. It's simple as that, and that's why he's afraid of democracy with its neighbors, especially former Soviet satellite states. So he's trying to oppose that, try to destabilize those countries in case of Georgia and Ukraine with everything that he can. Now, I mentioned that Russia is very corrupt, so they want to maintain power. Putin arguably is one of the richest men in the world. Some estimate that his personal wealth is over $200 billion. Now, also, if you follow closely Ukrainian conflict, President Obama is saying with some of the Western leaders, their demands are to de-escalate situation in eastern Ukraine. Well, to me, that's a very timid and weak position, and why? Because they have to start with a demand to withdraw troops from Crimea and give back Crimea to its rightful owner, which is Ukraine. So they are not starting with that. So to begin with, that's a kind of wrong position to start, to just kind of put Crimea aside, table that issue, and talk about something else, which is situation in eastern Ukraine. And that shows timidness and weakness to Putin, and somebody like Putin thrives on that when opponent is weak. Also, you might not know, but United States in a violation of international agreement when it regards to Ukraine. In 1994, United States signed agreement with Ukraine, Russia, and Great Britain, guaranteeing Ukrainian territorial integrity if Ukraine in 1994 would give up former Soviet nuclear arsenal, which it did, because of that agreement. So in other words, we guaranteed that we would defend their territorial integrity, and we are not doing so. Now, I'm going to touch a little bit about, I'm not talking about militarily defend, and I'll explain a little bit better what I mean. But we are in violation of that agreement. Now, that agreement, why it was important when it was signed? If not that agreement, if not transfer from nuclear arsenal from Ukraine to Russia, because Russia already has a big arsenal, obviously. But because of situation in the country is not very stable, country is still developing, country is still post-Soviet era, there was a high probability or possibility that some rogue element could get hold of the nuclear material. And you all know what that could have meant for the United States. So that's why it was so important, first of all, to have that agreement and to have that transfer happen. And then that's why it is so important that we should keep our word and we should, keep up with our obligations. Now, some of you might say, well, how are we going to defend or get involved with Ukraine militarily? We are not going to go to war with Russia. I'm not advocating that, and we do not need to do that. I mentioned already a few times that our position was weak and timid, and also what I mean by that, the sanctions that we imposed were very weak, and we should have and could have done much harsher sanctions. So initially, if you remember, there were like 7 or 11 people from the government. Then that number went to 21 or 30 or so. So it was almost comical and laughable when we are talking about such an important issue and you are sanctioning 30 people. As opposed to, we could sanction, and we still can do it, sectors of the Russian economy, which is energy sector. So if energy sector, and it's easily doable because they are integrated with international financing system, they need international financial institutions to fund their operations, so it's easily doable. And but we are not doing it. We are right now talking about it, and just recently, just several days ago, literally, we were gonna supposedly do it, and they still kind of stopped, they still kind of watered down, and they still did not go all the way. And that's unfortunate. But you also might notice that recently Putin is making some kind of a conciliatory statement. Last month there was election in Ukraine, new Ukrainian president was elected, pro-Western politician Petro Poroshenko, which is a good thing. Also, let me just jump back a little bit. When this conflict started, some people here in the United States were saying, why we should help Ukraine? They are not fighting. They are just giving up their posts and they are retreating. Well, that's partially true. And reason for that, that they had this temporary president. It's very difficult to send people harm's way and get this, war going and bloodshed when somebody is not elected. We're talking about mandate. So that was one of the reasons. As opposed to now, when there's a new elected president, right now situation has changed drastically. Ukrainian troops started attacking those separatists, and right now situation in that regard has changed. So back to sanctions, and I mentioned that Putin recently started making some conciliatory statement. Why? Report is that the United States, with its Western allies, found his money. So if you read up the stories, Ukraine-Russia conflict, you would see those articles and the sources of that article. The report is found, they found the money, and all of a sudden Putin's tone is changing. Now those sanctions, even though they were small and not enough, they still had some effect. I was involved my younger years in opposition movement in Georgia before I immigrated to the United States. And my first job in the United States was in New York. I was working for a nonprofit organization called Center for Democracy in the USSR. We were helping these fledgling democratic movements in the Soviet Union. It was still Soviet Union, 1990, 91. In 91, Soviet Union dissolved and they cut funding for our organization. So we kind of went our separate ways. But through that organization and through that work, I still maintained contact with a lot of people in many of the republics, including Ukraine, including Russia, and Baltics, and obviously my native Georgia. The reason I'm saying that, I'm in communication with them almost daily. And in Russia, even those limited sanctions have an effect. And also there is an effect of people waking up and seeing that, let's face it, a lot of people, majority of Russian, I think I moved something here. Is there a volume adjustment? I inadvertently. Okay, thank you. I'll be more careful. And so I talked to them, and people are waking up. And let's face it, majority of Russians were supporting, and probably still are, as far as percentage, probably Putin still has a majority. But a lot of people, the numbers are changing, trend is changing, they are waking up, and they are realizing that Putin is destroying Russia in the long run. Now, why he's destroying Russia? First of all, it was wrong on so many levels to attack another country and annex its land. But you may also have seen the report that Crimea used to belong to Russia. Well, so what? Russia has 1/7 part of the world as far as the landmass. Not all of them, not more than half of them was Russia. So the whole idea is after Soviet Union dissolved, we had to stay within those boundaries and republics and respect each other's territorial integrity. Because in case of Russia, Russia's got 60 autonomic regions of its own. So what does that mean? If in Crimea Russia is succeeding, they are giving an example that such a thing is possible. So when Russia is not as strong or doesn't have such a strong man as it has today and those high oil dollars, then what's going to happen with those other republics within Russia? Does Russia want that? Should Russia want that? Of course not. And nobody else should want that because we don't want to see the mess, we don't want to see the wars, we don't want to see the mass killings because we're talking about 60 autonomic regions within Russia that are not Russians. Like Chechnya, they already have, and the conflict is actually still ongoing. But besides Chechnya, there are others. There's Dagestan, Ingushetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, and so on and so forth, 60 of them. And all of them could, down the road, seek to do the same thing, just like Russia did with Crimea. That's one of the reasons it was so silly to do so, and that's one of the reasons when I make statements saying Putin is destroying Russia in the long run. And fortunately, people started waking up and understanding that. Even Russians in Crimea, the reports are, they are regretting, they are disappointed. They thought, or whatever they thought, but they are realizing their mistake. But again, you cannot totally blame them because that was kind of forced thing because coming money from Russia, coming this security KGB personnel and doing their evil deeds, and unfortunately in this stage, temporarily they succeed. Hopefully that will be corrected. Hopefully Ukraine will be able to get back Crimea. And hopefully, whether it will be this president or next president, will do the right thing. And hopefully next red line will be the red line. And hopefully we'll get rid of, frankly, this evil emperor called Putin. And everybody will be much better off. I could take... I will take some of your questions if you have them for me.
Where's Putin's money?
I'm sorry?
Where's Putin's money?
Probably mostly in Switzerland, but also there's so many ways to, so many places that he could have had. Obviously, I'm not privy to the specifics, but offshore, a lot of different countries, a lot of different banks. Some of them could be in Caribbeans, and but there are serious reports. It's not like rumors. There are serious reports, and you can find them on the internet from serious sources that money is found. And the fact that Putin has changed his tone. Recently, for example, the Ukrainian president declared ceasefire just from his initiative, his side, and Putin kind of applauded that, and he made some conciliatory statement. And a source of that article, and author of those kind of articles, actually there are more than one, they are relating that precisely to that his money was found, and it's a very large amount. Obviously, him and his cronies, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and they don't want to lose that. As far as sanctions, I touched earlier that we have to do the sector sanctions, meaning against the oil sector and the energy sector of Russia, and those would be very meaningful, very harsh, very effective sanctions, and that would stop Putin, because he would have no other way. If his money is drying up, that's 70–80% of their income. They simply will not stand. They simply won't be able to survive. I think with those kind of sanctions, within a month or two, that conflict could be solved. And so we'll see. Yes, ma'am.
Would the Europeans go along with that because they rely on that oil?
You're right, but that's a matter of leadership. First of all, you should tell to Europeans, you meaning President Obama, that what is the alternative? Today is Crimea. Tomorrow is Eastern Ukraine. The day after is rest of Ukraine. Then is Moldova. Then is rest of Georgia. When is the end? So when Russia is threatening, or potentially is threatening, to cut off huge supply of gas to Germany, for example, that's the biggest supplier, we should turn the tables. We should call their bluff. And we should say, coming from the United States and Germany, you know what, we are not going to buy your gas. What are they going to do? Who are they going to sell to? I mean, they cannot just change overnight pipelines and, I mean, we should call their bluff. Instead, they are not holding strong cards and they are bluffing. And we do have a strong cards, we just don't know how to play them.
Anybody in Washington doing anything about it?
Well, again, unfortunately, and I'm not talking as a Republican or Democrat, that's a sad commentary, but unfortunately, while President Obama is in office, they might not do it. They are talking about it, but they still, when push comes to shove, they have not so far at least declared those harsh sanctions. As far as the rest of Washington, Congress is on a right course. As I mentioned, I work with them and I meet them, whether it's there or here or other ways of communications. They are trying to force President Obama to get tougher and to do some of those things actually I mentioned, because I had a specific conversation with congressmen, and they kind of all agree, at least the circle that I'm talking to, they all agree that would be the right way to go. It's just a matter of whether President, as it comes to those kind of decisions, obviously President has the upper hand as far as making or not making those moves. Yes.
Is there a stranglehold over access to the internet in Russia regarding this issue as there is in China, where they manipulate it?
Well, internet, I apologize not having better specific, but if I'm not mistaken, I heard and read that Putin is trying to restrict that, but through internet it's still available. It's still available. What is not available is through the normal mass media, which is the print media or the TV stations. That's totally controlled by Putin. And also when I sometimes argue with some of my friends about Putin being elected, well, when he controls everything, when he kills and imprisons opposition, of course he's going to be elected. And but the mass media is still, as far as the social media, Facebook and those, I think it's still accessible to the people, whoever has the access to internet coming from the specific situation. So numbers are changing, but still more work needs to be done.
No, along the same vein, is there any kind of a group within Russia that is fighting for some sort of democracy, some sort of like a Radio America, sort of the Radio Free America, to get in and to reach out to the Russian people? Is there any kind of an effort being made to kind of push from that direction as well? As to
yes, of course there are groups, and actually there's a presidential candidate who is, I believe, being imprisoned again. Boris Nemtsov, I believe his name. Yeah, there is opposition. Unfortunately, they are not as strong. But it's largely due to because Putin's violent way of doing things. He's getting rid of opposition, arresting, harassing, and in some cases killing. And when I mentioned killing, there were cases of killing of his biggest critics. Politkovskaya, she was a famous journalist, and there were some others. And all the implications are that was the KGB killing on behalf of Putin. So,
Was that the gentleman that was poisoned?
no, that was actually Lady Politkovskaya, but gentleman was Litvinenko, who was poisoned. He was former KGB officer himself, and that's a very interesting story. I don't know if you heard or read about it. Actually, Litvinenko, he was in Great Britain when he was poisoned, and later he did not die right away, but later he died in a hospital. And what he did, and that's very interesting, when Putin came to power after Yeltsin, and that was kind of orchestrated thing because Yeltsin was kind of drunk all the time, and they lost first Chechen war, so Russian pride was hurt, so they needed somebody strong man to correct that course. So Putin was kind of KGB guy, so he was selected within that KGB rulers of the country. So, but he needed a reason to go back to Chechnya because Chechen war was lost, but there was nothing else going on. So why would you go back? Okay, war was lost, but Chechen is still within Russia, so anyway, KGB came out. Looks like, according to Litvinenko, who was later poisoned and killed, came up with a plan to bomb Russian apartment buildings within Russia and blame that on Chechen rebels. Can you imagine how far this guy Putin can go to do his thing? I mean, kill his own people by hundreds. And I've seen on a YouTube, I think it's still available, video, there is some Duma, which is Russian Congress, committee meeting, and it's a kind of closed door meeting. Yet, by Litvinenko, that was made available to public. So, and I don't remember exactly dates, but let's say it's September 13th. So, people from the KGB side, FSB, today's FSB, they're reading a report and saying that on a September 17th, on such and such city, such and such apartment, was bombed, likely by Chechen terrorists, and so many, approximately so many people died. Except that was September 13th when he was reading that document and saying it was September 17th. Guess what? September 17th, that bombing took place. At the time, public did not know about that meeting, but then it leaked out. It leaked out by Litvinenko why he was poisoned and killed and that's confirmed by the international law enforcement that was killed by Russian FSB agent because of order from Putin. He made that video public. So they still went ahead, and there is a Russian politician, Zhirinovsky. He's an obnoxious man. He's always cursing everybody, starting with Jews or anything that's not Russian. And but even him. There is another footage that confronting FSB people. How can you say, just repeating what happened and how that could have happened, and they made him, quiet. I mean, he's still there, but Putin probably had a conversation with him. So, and but again, it's incredible. It sounds like from a movie, but that's exactly why Litvinenko was killed and poisoned. So, yes, ma'am.
By the grapevine in areas that Putin is also now going after the Jewish and the Christian religion in areas. And it's just kind of every now and then leaking out in the press, but not too much is being said. And the Jewish people there are kind of concerned that they're going to be another wipeout like there was back in the 30s and 40s. And the same thing with some of the Christians, that he's putting a lot of restrictions on some of the Christian areas. You can't do this, you can't do that, and things. Is that?
Well,
is that true? Because it is leaking out in areas.
I'll tell you best of my ability, because as far as Jews, I have not heard specifically that he's targeting Jews per se, but that politician I mentioned, Zhirinovsky, and there are some other leaders within the government that openly attacking Jews, and that should be worrisome. Maybe that's what you mean, and that's what you've heard. As far as Christian, I think that situation is a little different. On the contrary, he's kind of using churches for his deeds. In other words, he's saying that West is evil, and democracy brings some evil things with it, and he's talking about the gay issue and some sexual other issues and some others. So he's using church, and church is full of still KGB agents, because it has not been too long that Soviet Union dissolved, and church was very heavily penetrated with KGB agents.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm hearing, is that the churches are now getting penetrated again.
Yes.
And changing, this is what,
Well, they are using that to justify their strongman rule and restrict, whether it's a Facebook or some other sources, because they are saying that brings, some filth and whatever the other terms that he's using. But he's using church to kind of highlight and oppose the Western, the democracy, and maintain his rule. But fortunately or unfortunately, actually fortunately, he doesn't have a good end game. Dictator and emperor should not have a good end game. And with the Ukrainian situation, he kind of cornered himself. There is no good out for him, unless, of course, President Obama gives him some out, and hopefully not. But situation is still dangerous because regardless of that conciliatory things that I mentioned, you cannot trust him. He might make some conciliatory statements, but tomorrow he could send more troops to Ukraine. Definitely, whatever he's doing, he cannot trust his motives, or he does not have good intentions, whether it comes to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, or any other in that region. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a sense that Putin needs to accomplish a lot before Obama is out of office, and somebody else that would come in?
Absolutely.
Allow him to do what
Absolutely, and that's what we are afraid of. In this case, when I say we, meaning the people from that region, and everybody's talking about the same thing. What's going to happen within the next 2 years, and maybe he'll do irreparable damage. But again, as we speak, damage is already done. So many hundreds of people have died in Ukraine, and still fighting is going on and dying, and all of that was instigated by Putin. I would go even further when I say about Putin, when I say about harsh sanctions and a strong stand from the United States and strong, clear demands, starting with getting out of Crimea and giving back to its rightful owner to Ukraine. I would go further saying that Putin should be referred to international court as an international war criminal. God knows he's done enough. But again, we should have this kind of, I would not even say bold moves, those right moves, call what it is. And only those kind of moves, only those kind of clear statements, just like Reagan-esque statements, that's what Putin and people like Putin understand. We have to be from a position of strength, because we do, thank God, still have more strength than they do. But the difference between us, we are standing for good, and they are standing, in this case of Putin, for evil. Now, one thing I'm going to say, anything I've said here today is not directed against Russian people. That's against Putin and his regime. I've got many friends in Russia, Russians, and I would argue that we should rescue them while helping allies, whether it's Ukraine or Georgia, because it is in our national security interest as well to have eventually Russia not to disintegrate and not to have a chaos between those 60 autonomic regions that I mentioned, but on the contrary, we have to do everything we can to help, first of all, good opposition democratic movements in Russia to finally win, finally get rid of Putin, and then to have this kind of a smooth transition as possible. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Now, before you go.
Oh, sure.
First one.